let's talk about the settlement of the New England colonies. These are from pages 42 to 50 in our book. We'll start with Plymouth. And Plymouth was founded by the Pilgrims. And the Pilgrims were the group of people in England who disapproved of all the Catholic elements in the Anglican Church. We've talked about this already. The Anglican Church, the Church of England, was formed merely so Henry VIII could get a divorce. Unlike other Protestant religions, it didn't have a big problem with Catholic rituals and other Catholic elements in the church. So they didn't change very much. The Pilgrims were the people that were so upset with these Catholic elements that they left the Anglican Church. They separated from it, which is why they're sometimes called separatists. At first, they had to leave England, of course, since they're no longer part of the Church of England. So at first, they went to the Netherlands in 1608. But in 1617, they realized that their children were becoming more Dutch than English. And they didn't like that. They didn't want to raise their children in the Netherlands. So they made a plan to sail for America. And that plan comes to fruition in 1620, when the ship that they had hired, the Mayflower, leaves England on course for Virginia. Here's Virginia down here. That's where they were supposed to land, but they got blown off course and actually landed here in Massachusetts. That's important because that means that their patent, their charter, their document that says they have a right to form a government in the New World is null and void. It has no meaning anymore because they're not in the right place. So before they leave the Mayflower, many of the people on board, or many of the men on board, sign what's called the Mayflower Compact, which was an agreement that they made to make a government, live under its rules, and follow its orders. Early on, the Pilgrims experienced problems. They were in debt from the journey over, and they needed to make a profit too to pay off that debt. There's also the problem of disease. This new world is a harsh environment for Europeans, and they're suffering from disease. Not on the same scale as in Virginia, and certainly not on the same scale as, say, Native Americans in Mexico when they encountered the Spaniards, but there is still a problem with disease in the Plymouth Colony. There's also the problem of starvation. They are struggling to farm, they are struggling to find food, and they probably wouldn't have survived if not from help from local Indians like Squanto and others. At the first Thanksgiving, they came together with their Indian allies and celebrated. I made this joke that the Indians brought all these things, whereas the Pilgrims were only able to provide these. That's a joke. The Puritans are another group of upset Anglicans, another group of people in England upset with the Anglican Church, and they're going to found the Massachusetts Bay Colony. They, unlike the separatists, they didn't want to leave the Anglican Church. They wanted to clean it up. They wanted to purify it. Charles I, King of England, is not interested in making any changes to the Anglican Church. In fact, he knew there was corruption in the church and tolerated it. In fact, Charles I is friendly to Catholic nations around Europe. And in fact, Charles I supported almost all of the church leaders that were opposed by the Puritans. There were certain leaders in the Anglican Church that upset the Puritans more than others. These are the guys that they want removed. Charles I throws his support behind these guys. So, the Puritans secure a charter to create a colony in the New World where they can live in peace and worship as they see fit. Through possible bribery, they're able to get a loophole in their charter contract, which says that their company meetings could be held anywhere, not just in England. So unlike the Virginia Company, which had to stay based in England, this company, the Massachusetts Bay Company, is going to be able to hold their meetings wherever they want, meaning they can have their meetings in the New World, meaning less royal intervention into their affairs. In 1630, there are 2,000 people in New England. But by 1645, that has grown to over 16,000. There's dramatic growth in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. And we have a little bit different emigration to the Massachusetts Bay Colony. We have some entire villages emigrating to the Massachusetts Bay Colony. We have a lot of farmers going to the New World, and we even have some textile workers. So we have people who are used to living together. We have people that are used to farming and doing that kind of work. And we have people with some industrial skills as well. Compared to Virginia, there are a lot more families that come over and a lot fewer single men than in Virginia. This means that we also have a lot more balanced male to female ratio in New England. There's also a better survival rate. There's better drinking water, and overall it's a better, safer climate than what was settled in Virginia. And unlike the county in Virginia, the town becomes the center of public life in the Massachusetts Bay Colony. These people, unlike the people in Virginia who are really all in it for themselves, it seemed like at times, the people in the Massachusetts Bay Colony, and Plymouth as well, are really bound by a common sense of purpose. And for them, that's serving God. And we can see this in John Winthrop's speech, A City on a Hill. This was a sermon that the leader of the Puritans delivered, in which he compared what they were doing in the Massachusetts Bay Colony to a city on a hill. And he said that the eyes of the world would be on them to see if they failed. And if they failed, people would say it was God's failure. So there's extra pressure, there's extra incentive for the Puritans to do well and be successful in the New World, because they don't want to make God look bad. Skip over that. In the Massachusetts Bay Colony, they practice something known as congregationalism, and that's where every congregation is independent and could really make a lot of their own rules. So some churches, many churches in fact, allowed women and allowed African Americans to become full church members. And pretty soon, throughout New England, all male church members were allowed to vote on civil issues and on public offices. They got to vote on the governor, they got to vote on the judges, and they got to vote on the military officers, the people who would be in charge of the colony's protection. However, it is not a democracy. Those officials got their power from the people, but they said they were responsible to God. They are not answering to the requests and needs and desires of the people. They're doing what God thought they wanted them to do for their colony. However, it's not a theocracy, because ministers had no official political power. They certainly had influence in the community, but they were banned from holding public office. They definitely, even though it's not technically a democracy, they definitely believed in the rule of law. And in 1648, the legislature in the Massachusetts Bay Colony passed what's known as the Laws and Liberties. This is the first alphabetized code of laws printed in English. All right? It is one of those documents that influences, it's one of the roots of the Constitution. The reason being, this document explains the rights to the colonists, and it prevents the governors that are elected from just exercising arbitrary authority. It's also important to remember that although they were religiously persecuted in England, they are not religiously tolerant. Roger Williams is a good example of this. He was a preacher who believed religion was not for men to decide. He believed that the religious leaders of the Massachusetts Bay Colony were making too many decisions that really should be God's decision. For these beliefs, he's banished from the colony, and he goes next door, basically, and creates Providence, Rhode Island, where there is no religious persecution. Another example of their lack of religious toleration is Anne Hutchinson, and she really challenged the religious and political leaders of the Massachusetts Bay Colony by exercising a lot more religious authority. She led Bible studies, and this wasn't something women did. As a result, she's banished as well, and she goes to live in Rhode Island. The map of New England, we see New Hampshire, and that's originally part of Massachusetts and will become its own colony later, as it's economically dependent on Massachusetts early on. And in Connecticut, Connecticut was mainly found by people who left Massachusetts, people who came to Massachusetts but wanted better land or wanted better opportunities. So they left and settled in Connecticut. Their leader is a man by the name of Thomas Hooker. He was a prominent minister and sometimes political philosopher. And he helped write the Fundamental Orders of Connecticut. This is the Connecticut Colony's constitution. In fact, it's the first written constitution possibly ever. And in 1662, they were granted a charter to form their own colony.